As of this Thursday afternoon, the Weather Prediction Center in College Park, Maryland, put out a bulletin that meteorologists across the eastern United States have been waiting on for days. The language was blunt, dangerous. Near-record heat is expanding across the West through the weekend. Severe thunderstorms and heavy rainfall are moving from the Midwest into the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, and daily rounds of heavy downpours are bringing localized flash flooding risks to the southeast. That is not a summer weather update. That is a warning, issued in real time, and it sets the stage for what forecasters now believe will be a turbulent 10 days along the entire eastern seaboard, from the coast of Maine down through the Carolinas and into Florida. For weeks now, the pattern over North America has been locked into something meteorologists call an omega block, named for the shape it makes on a weather map, resembling the Greek letter omega. A dome of high pressure sits over the western United States, baking the desert southwest and the high plains under a heat wave forecasters describe as major to extreme. On the other side of that ridge, a trough has been parked over the eastern half of the country, and troughs are notorious for pulling in cooler air aloft while dragging waves of moisture and instability across the same corridor of cities again and again. That is exactly what has been happening, and it is exactly what is about to intensify. Let's start with the number that is grabbing the most attention: the heat. The Climate Prediction Center's most recent monthly outlook gives the southeast and the southern mid-Atlantic better than 50% odds of running above normal temperatures through August. That confidence level is unusually high for a seasonal outlook, and forecasters are pointing to two main drivers. First, dry soil across the southeast has been priming the ground to heat up faster and hold that heat longer, because there isn't enough soil moisture left to evaporate and cool the air near the surface. Second, coastal waters off the southeast and mid-Atlantic have been running warmer than average, and warm water keeps humidity high even overnight, which means fewer hours of relief between one scorching afternoon and the next. Layered on top of that seasonal signal is a moderate-strength El Niño, which forecasters say is still strengthening in the tropical Pacific. Sea surface temperatures in the benchmark Niño 3. 4 region were running about 1.3 degrees Celsius above normal in the most recent weekly reading. El Niño tends to shift the jet stream and reorganize where the wettest and driest zones set up across North America, and this year it is combining with a stalled Madden-Julian oscillation, that traveling pulse of tropical rainfall and wind that circles the globe every few weeks, to lock in the pattern we are about to describe for you day by day. So here is what that means for the next 10 days, starting today and running through the first full week of August. Today and tonight, the immediate story along the coast is the departure of a coastal low that has been anchored near New England. As that system pulls away, it leaves behind lingering moisture, and a slowly dissipating frontal boundary is merging with a wave lifting out of the Midwest toward the northeast. Forecasters expect that combination to trigger scattered showers and thunderstorms that will gradually edge toward the coast through the middle of the week. It is not a single dramatic storm. It is a rolling series of disturbances, one after another, each one capable of dumping heavy rain in a short window. That rolling pattern matters because the ground underneath it is already saturated. Recent heavy rains across parts of the northern mid-Atlantic and southern New England have lowered what meteorologists call flash flood guidance values, which is a technical way of saying it now takes less rain than usual to trigger flash flooding in those areas. When the soil is already full and the creeks are already running high, even a routine summer thunderstorm can turn a street into a river within 20 minutes. The Weather Prediction Center has specifically flagged central North Carolina, the coastal mid-Atlantic, and southern New York State and southern New England as areas carrying an elevated risk of excessive rainfall through the early part of this outlook. And while forecasters describe confidence in the exact placement as low this far out, they are treating the broader threat as real enough to put out a formal excessive rainfall discussion 2 separate times this week alone. At the same time that rain threat is unfolding in the north, a very different hazard is intensifying in the south. Forecasters are describing a moderate risk of excessive rainfall for parts of the northern mid-Atlantic and southern New England, paired with a continuing severe thunderstorm threat stretching from the mid-Atlantic down into the Carolinas. That means damaging wind gusts, large hail, and the possibility of a few tornadoes, particularly where slow-moving storm clusters train over the same communities repeatedly. Meteorologists have been careful to note that this isn't a single squall line racing through and clearing out. These are the kinds of storms that stall, dump their heaviest rain in one spot, and then get replaced by the next cell doing the exact same thing. Now, layer the heat on top of all that instability. As we move from today into the weekend, the ridge of high pressure over the western United States is expected to hold firm, and while the most extreme heat stays centered over the desert southwest and the western high plains, the warmth is going to lean eastward at the edges. Forecasters are watching for that ridge to erode slightly at its northern edge early next week, as a cold front moves through the Pacific Northwest and into the northern plains. But the important detail for East Coast residents is what happens on the other side of that breakdown. Even as the west cools slightly in spots, the ridge's energy transfers east, and troughing continues to amplify from the Great Lakes into the Mid-South. That keeps the eastern United States locked into an unsettled, muggy, storm-prone pattern rather than delivering a clean break. By the time we reach the weekend into early next week, cities up and down the Interstate 95 corridor should expect a stretch of high humidity layered under whatever heat builds in. New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington are all sitting in the zone forecasters have specifically called out as likely to feel the brunt of both the wet pattern and the building heat. When you combine afternoon temperatures pushing into the 90s with dew points holding in the 70s, heat index values can climb into the range of 100 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the most extreme pockets, as high as 115. That range isn't just uncomfortable. The National Weather Service has said plainly that this kind of heat is impactful to anyone, not just older adults, not just young children, not just people who spend all day outdoors. Warm overnight lows sitting in the 70s mean bodies don't get the recovery period they need between one hot day and the next, and that cumulative stress is what turns a hot week into a dangerous one. Here's where the tropical picture comes in, because this is the piece a lot of people are asking about. As of this week, the news out of the Atlantic Basin is, for the moment, reassuring. There's no tropical development expected in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, or the broader Atlantic over the coming week. July is set to close out with no named tropical development in that basin at all. The remnants of what had been post-tropical storm Arthur dissipated over eastern Louisiana, and while that system brought a period of significant, even locally life-threatening rainfall as it moved through, it is not tracking toward the east coast, and it is done as an organized system. That said, forecasters want to be clear that quiet does not mean guaranteed quiet for the full 10 days. The eastern Pacific, on the other side of Mexico, is a different story entirely. Major Hurricane Genevieve is churning off Mexico's west coast with sustained winds near 130 miles per hour, and while it is not expected to make landfall, it is generating large swells that will reach the beaches of Southern California this week. Farther out, Hurricane Fausto is tracking toward Hawaii, expected to weaken before arrival, but still capable of bringing rain and gusty winds to the islands. Neither of those systems threatens the east coast directly, but forecasters watch basin-wide tropical activity as a package, because a busy eastern Pacific and a quiet Atlantic often reflect the same broader pattern of wind shear and moisture transport across the hemisphere. The moderate El Niño currently in place tends to increase wind shear over the tropical Atlantic, which is one reason forecasters aren't yet worried about a fast-developing threat to the east coast from the tropics during this specific 10-day window. But August is historically when the Atlantic hurricane season begins to wake up, and meteorologists are already saying they will be watching the deep tropics more closely as we move past the midpoint of this outlook period. Let's walk through the rest of the 10 days region by region, because the story is not the same from Maine to Florida. In New England, the immediate concern is the tail end of that departing coastal low and the leftover moisture streaming in behind it. Southern New England in particular has already seen enough rain recently that additional heavy downpours carry an outsized flooding risk, even if the totals aren't record-breaking. As the week progresses, forecasters expect New England to transition into the warm, humid regime affecting the rest of the corridor, with afternoon thunderstorm chances remaining in play through the back half of the outlook period. Boston, Hartford, and Providence should expect a stretch of sticky, unsettled days rather than one clean washout, punctuated by pop-up storms that can turn intense with little warning. Moving into the northern mid-Atlantic, New York City and the surrounding metro area are sitting directly in the bullseye that forecasters have flagged twice this week for excessive rainfall potential. The city's aging stormwater infrastructure struggles even with routine summer downpours, and when guidance values are already lowered from recent rain, a fast-moving thunderstorm cell parked over one borough for even 30 minutes can produce flash flooding on streets and in subway stations. Add building heat on top of that, and residents are looking at a stretch where they may need to watch both a flood warning and a heat advisory on the same day. Philadelphia and the broader Delaware Valley fall into a similar pattern. Forecasters have highlighted this corridor as one of the areas most likely to see the moderate excessive rainfall risk materialize, and the city's history with flash flooding along smaller creeks and low-lying roadways means local officials will likely be watching radar closely through the middle stretch of this outlook. At the same time, Philadelphia is one of the specific cities forecasters named as facing the brunt of the coming heat, so expect messaging from local emergency management about both hazards running in parallel rather than one replacing the other. Baltimore and Washington, D.C. carry that same dual threat. Both cities were specifically named by the National Weather Service as expected to feel the heat this stretch, and both sit close enough to the coastal mid-Atlantic zone that forecasters have flagged for elevated rainfall risk. What makes this pairing particularly tricky for these cities is the humidity. Washington's summer dew points are already notoriously high, And when that moisture combines with slow-moving thunderstorm clusters, the region tends to see localized flooding in the same low-lying spots that flood every summer, even while the official rain totals for the broader metro area look unremarkable on a map. Farther south, central and eastern North Carolina sit inside the specific zone the Weather Prediction Center called out by name for elevated excessive rainfall risk running into the early days of August. Combine that with the ongoing severe thunderstorm threat stretching from the mid-Atlantic into the Carolinas, and this region is facing the most layered set of hazards in the entire outlook. Heavy rain, the potential for damaging wind and hail, and an isolated tornado risk, all against a backdrop of building heat. Charlotte, Raleigh, and the coastal communities near Wilmington should expect an unsettled stretch where thunderstorm watches and warnings could be a near daily feature. Georgia and the Deep South, while technically outside the tightest bullseye, are not being left out of this story. The Southeast broadly is one of the two regions the Climate Prediction Center specifically flagged for above normal heat odds this August, and daily rounds of heavy downpours are already bringing localized flash flooding risk to the region as this outlook begins. That means Atlanta and the surrounding area should expect a familiar late summer rhythm. Hot, humid mornings building into explosive afternoon thunderstorms that can dump an inch or more of rain in under an hour before clearing out by evening, only for the pattern to repeat again the next day. Florida sits in an interesting position in this outlook. The peninsula's afternoon thunderstorm cycle is a near constant feature of Florida summers regardless of the broader pattern. But this year, that baseline risk is compounding with the same warm coastal waters and high humidity affecting the rest of the southeast. Combined with a quiet tropical Atlantic for the moment, Florida's main threat through this window looks less like an organized tropical system and more like the routine but genuinely dangerous cycle of heat index values climbing into the low hundreds each afternoon, paired with sudden, locally intense downpours, capable of flash flooding streets in low-lying coastal communities. There's also an air quality angle worth mentioning, because it doesn't always get the same attention as heat and flooding, but it compounds both. Earlier this summer, wildfire smoke drifting down from Canada pushed into the Midwest and the East at levels not seen since the late 1990s. And while that specific smoke event has eased, the underlying wildfire season producing it is still active. When smoke does drift back into the picture during a stretch of high heat and high humidity, it tends to sit closer to the ground rather than dispersing, because the same stagnant blocked pattern that traps heat also traps particulate pollution. Anyone with asthma, other respiratory conditions, or heart disease should treat any air quality alert issued during this window as seriously as a heat advisory, since the combination of poor air quality and extreme heat puts extra strain on the same population that is already most vulnerable to the heat itself. The persistent heat also has ripple effects well beyond how uncomfortable it feels to walk outside. Utility companies across the mid-Atlantic and southeast are almost certainly watching electricity demand climb as air conditioners run nonstop through both the day and the unusually warm nights. And grid operators in these regions have dealt with strain during past heat waves of this magnitude, sometimes asking customers to voluntarily conserve energy during peak afternoon hours to avoid rolling outages. Losing power during a stretch like this isn't just an inconvenience. It can become dangerous quickly, especially for older residents or anyone relying on medical equipment at home. If you live in an area with a history of heat-related outages, it's worth having a basic plan ready, whether that means knowing where the nearest cooling center is or keeping a portable battery or generator charged and ready to go. Transportation networks tend to feel this kind of pattern too. Airports across the affected corridor, including the major hubs in New York, Philadelphia, and the Washington area, are prone to afternoon thunderstorm delays during exactly this kind of repeated, slow-moving storm pattern. And those delays have a way of cascading through the national flight network within hours. Heat itself can also restrict some aircraft operations at the margins, since extreme high temperatures reduce the density of the air and can limit how much weight certain planes are cleared to carry on takeoff. On the ground, sustained extreme heat has been known to cause pavement buckling on roads and, in some cases, speed restrictions on rail lines where tracks expand under prolonged high temperatures. None of this is guaranteed to happen over the next 10 days, but travelers moving through the region during this stretch should build in extra flexibility, because both the heat and the storms are the kinds of conditions that historically produce exactly these disruptions. Agriculture is another area quietly absorbing the impact of this pattern. Farmers across the southeast and southern mid-Atlantic are dealing with the same dry soil conditions, feeding into the region's above normal heat odds. And crops already stressed by limited rainfall can suffer further damage when intense heat arrives on top of a moisture deficit. At the same time, when rain does arrive in the short, torrential bursts forecasters are describing for the southeast, it often runs off stressed, compacted soil rather than soaking in evenly, which limits how much benefit farmers actually see from any single storm. Livestock producers face their own version of this challenge, since extended heat with little overnight relief is a well-documented driver of heat stress in cattle and poultry, prompting many operations to shift feeding schedules earlier in the day and add extra water and shade access during exactly this kind of stretch. It's worth pausing to compare this outlook with what the East Coast experienced earlier this summer because the pattern has an uncomfortable sense of déjà vu. Back in late June, a long and dangerous heat wave pushed temperatures into the hundreds across New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, with more than 100 record highs set in a matter of days and roughly 250 record warm overnight lows recorded alongside them. That earlier event also brought heat index values in the range of 100 to 110 degrees, and in the hardest hit spots as high as 115, forcing the cancellation of summer camps and outdoor activities across parts of the Midwest, as communities opened cooling centers and urged residents to take precautions. The pattern driving this current 10-day outlook shares the same basic architecture: a dominant western ridge, an eastern trough, and a corridor of cities caught in between. The difference this time is the added emphasis on flash flooding and severe thunderstorms layered directly on top of the heat, rather than heat standing alone as the dominant hazard. Now, stepping back from the regional breakdown, let's talk about the mechanics of why this particular pattern is proving so persistent. Because understanding the why helps explain why forecasters are confident enough to issue a 10-day warning rather than just a next-day advisory. The core issue is that big, blocky ridge sitting over the western United States. High-pressure ridges like this one act almost like a boulder in a stream. Upper-level winds, the same jet stream that normally pushes weather systems from west to east across the country in a matter of days, have to bend around that boulder rather than flow through it. When a ridge is as strong as the one forecasters are describing this week, roughly 600 decameters, which is an unusually robust reading for this time of year, it doesn't just deflect the jet stream a little. It forces a deep dip, a trough, somewhere downstream, and that trough is set up almost perfectly over the eastern United States. Troughs pull in cooler, more unstable air aloft. And when that unstable air overlays the warm, humid air, already sitting at the surface across the East Coast, you get exactly the kind of repeated thunderstorm development forecasters have been documenting for days. The reason this becomes a 10-day story rather than a 2-day story is that ridges like the one out west tend to be slow to break down. Forecasters are watching for some erosion at the ridge's northern edge early next week, as a cold front pushes through the Pacific Northwest and into the northern plains. But they are also explicit that the core of the heat will simply hold on farther south and west from California into the central and southern plains. Meanwhile, the eastern trough isn't going anywhere either. In fact, forecasters describe a second shortwave trough, amplifying from the Great Lakes into the Mid-South, even as the coastal low is departing New England, which means the East Coast isn't getting a clean break between disturbances. It's more like a relay race, with one wave of unsettled weather handing off to the next. This is also why the rain threat is expected to shift geographically, even within the 10-day window. Early on, the sharpest excessive rainfall risk sits over the coastal mid-Atlantic and southern New England. By days 4 and 5 of the outlook, that risk zone is expected to shift northwest, with forecasters flagging the eastern upper Great Lakes and the upper Ohio Valley for a slight risk of excessive rainfall. That doesn't mean the East Coast is in the clear by then. It means the specific bullseye for the heaviest rain moves, while the broader, unsettled, muggy, storm-prone conditions persist across the coastal corridor through the sunnier stretches in between systems. Given all of that, what should people actually do with this information over the next 10 days? Forecasters and emergency management officials tend to give the same core guidance whenever heat and flooding threats overlap like this, and it's worth walking through it plainly rather than treating it as an afterthought. On the heat side, the advice is straightforward but easy to underestimate. Limit strenuous outdoor activity to the early morning or evening hours when temperatures are at their lowest. Stay hydrated throughout the day rather than waiting until you feel thirsty, because thirst is already a sign that dehydration has started. Check on elderly neighbors, relatives, and anyone without reliable access to air conditioning, since warm overnight lows in the 70s mean homes without cooling don't get a real chance to lose heat after sunset. Never leave children or pets in parked vehicles, even for what feels like a short errand, because interior temperatures can climb to dangerous levels within minutes, even on a moderately warm day, let alone one where outdoor heat index values are already pushing past 100. And if your community has opened cooling centers, as many did during the earlier heat wave that hit the Midwest and East Coast back in late June and early July, treat them as a real resource rather than a last resort. On the flooding and severe storm side, the guidance is just as important, especially because flash flooding is one of the most underestimated weather hazards in the country. Never drive through a flooded roadway, even one that looks shallow, because it takes surprisingly little moving water to sweep a vehicle off the road. And the depth of water over a road is almost impossible to judge accurately from the driver's seat. If local officials issue a flash flood warning, that is not a suggestion to keep an eye on the sky. It means flooding is either happening or is imminent based on radar-indicated rainfall rates, and the appropriate response is to move to higher ground immediately if you're in a flood-prone area. For anyone in a basement apartment or a home with a history of water intrusion during heavy rain, this is the kind of 10-day stretch worth taking seriously enough to have a plan in place before the rain starts, not after. For the severe thunderstorm risk specifically affecting the mid-Atlantic into the Carolinas, keep in mind that these storms are capable of producing damaging straight-line winds, large hail, and isolated tornadoes, particularly in slow-moving clusters that can intensify with little advance notice. Having a way to receive warnings that doesn't depend on being awake and looking at a phone, such as a weather radio or emergency alerts enabled on a mobile device, is one of the simplest ways to make sure a nighttime severe thunderstorm doesn't catch a household off guard. Outdoor workers deserve a specific mention here, because they carry a disproportionate share of the risk during a stretch like this. Construction crews, landscapers, delivery drivers, agricultural workers, and anyone else whose job keeps them outside through the hottest part of the afternoon are facing repeated days where heat index values reach the range that OSHA and public health officials classify as high or extreme risk for heat illness. Employers in affected areas are typically encouraged to build in more frequent water and shade breaks, shift the most physically demanding tasks to early morning hours, and train supervisors to recognize the early signs of heat exhaustion, such as heavy sweating, dizziness, and nausea, before they progress into the far more dangerous territory of heat stroke, where sweating can actually stop and confusion sets in. Because this outlook describes not just one hot day, but a sustained 10-day stretch, the cumulative fatigue on outdoor workers compounds in a way that a single hot afternoon does not, and that's part of why occupational health officials tend to escalate their messaging specifically during multi-day heat events like this one, rather than treating every warm day the same. Coastal residents have one more factor worth watching alongside the rain and heat. That's the tide cycle. Even without a tropical system anywhere nearby, East Coast communities regularly deal with what's known as nuisance or minor tidal flooding during periods of astronomically high tides. And that kind of flooding can compound with heavy rainfall runoff during exactly the type of slow-moving thunderstorm pattern forecasters are describing for this window. A downpour that coincides with high tide along a bayside or low-lying coastal community can back up drainage systems that would otherwise handle the rain just fine, turning a routine summer storm into standing water on roads that don't normally flood. It's a reminder that this outlook isn't only about rainfall totals in isolation. Timing matters too, and coastal residents checking local tide charts alongside the rain forecast will have a clearer picture of when their specific neighborhood faces the highest combined risk. It's also worth addressing the drought angle briefly, because it connects directly back to why forecasters expect this heat to be so persistent. The dry, lean building across the southeast is adding to concerns about drought expanding in a region that is already running short on soil moisture in places. That matters beyond just comfort. Dry soil bakes faster under direct sun, which reinforces the very heat dome sitting over the region, creating a feedback loop where dry conditions and hot conditions reinforce each other. At the same time, when rain does fall on that same dry ground in short, intense bursts, as is expected repeatedly across the southeast through daily rounds of downpours, the soil often can't absorb it fast enough, which paradoxically increases flash flooding risk even in areas that are technically running a rainfall deficit for the month. It's a pattern that sounds contradictory. Drought and flash flooding happening in the same region within the same 10-day window, but it is a well-documented feature of exactly this kind of summer pattern. Looking further out, the Climate Prediction Center's broader outlook for August suggests this isn't just a 10-day anomaly that resolves itself once we flip the calendar page. The southeast and southern mid-Atlantic carry better than 50% odds of above normal heat for the month as a whole, and forecasters have said the picture could still shift as El Niño's strength and the Madden-Julian oscillations behavior become clearer in the coming weeks. In other words, this 10-day stretch may end up being the opening chapter of a broader, hot, humid, storm-prone August for the eastern half of the country, rather than an isolated event that clears out and gives way to something calmer. There is one more piece worth mentioning because it speaks to how quickly forecasts can still shift even with 10 days of lead time. Confidence in the exact placement of the heaviest rainfall late in this outlook period, particularly around days 4 and 5, is explicitly described by forecasters as low. That doesn't mean the broader threat isn't real. It means the exact county lines, the exact cities that end up under the bullseye for 2 inches of rain versus a quarter inch, are still moving around from one model run to the next. This is completely normal for a 10-day outlook, and it's exactly why meteorologists keep issuing updated discussions multiple times a day, rather than putting out a single forecast and walking away from it. If you live anywhere along this corridor, from New England through the Carolinas and down into Florida, the smart move over the coming days is to keep checking back on local forecasts, rather than treating any single day's outlook as the final word. So, to bring this together, the East Coast is heading into a 10-day stretch defined less by any single dramatic storm and more by a stubborn, self-reinforcing pattern. A powerful ridge out west is refusing to break down in a way that would let cooler, drier air spill east. In its place, a trough over the eastern United States is going to keep sending wave after wave of moisture and instability up the coast, triggering repeated rounds of heavy rain, localized flash flooding, and severe thunderstorms capable of damaging wind, hail, and isolated tornadoes, particularly from the mid-Atlantic into the Carolinas. Layered on top of that wet pattern is building heat, with humidity pushing heat index values into the 100 to 110 degree range and higher in spots, affecting major population centers including New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, alongside the broader Southeast, which the Climate Prediction Center already expects to run hot through the entire month of August. The tropics for now are quiet in the Atlantic Basin, giving the region one less immediate concern, but forecasters are watching that could change as the calendar moves deeper into hurricane season. None of this is presented by forecasters as a single catastrophic event. It's presented as a pattern, a sustained 10-day stretch, where the ingredients for both flooding and heat-related illness are going to keep showing up day after day, sometimes in the same city on the same afternoon. That is precisely why the warning matters. It's not about one storm to prepare for. It's about a run of days where the smartest thing anyone along the East Coast can do is stay informed, stay hydrated, respect flash flood warnings the moment they're issued, and understand that even though the sun might be out one afternoon, the next round of heavy rain or dangerous heat is very likely already forming just behind it. Keep an eye on your local National Weather Service office over the coming days, because as this pattern evolves, the specific timing and placement of the heaviest rain and the most extreme heat will keep getting refined. What forecasters are confident about right now is the broad shape of the next 10 days, hot, humid, unsettled, and demanding real attention from anyone living along the eastern seaboard.